Aloha friends, and welcome back once again to the Exotica Lounge, episode 6. This is going to be a fun one for me. Hopefully it's fun for you as well. This is actually probably where I wanted to start at the beginning when I thought of doing this podcast, but I thought maybe we should get some history out of the way first. But today we're going to be talking all about the instruments of Exotica, the actual musical instruments used to create this music, because a big part of the sound is really just the instruments that are being played. Now, this is a huge topic, probably unending, because we keep adding more and new instruments and sounds keep on being added to the arsenal of what's available. So this is probably going to come in multiple parts. And even with the format that I've set up, I've already thought of several instruments that don't really fit into it. So this is probably going to be an ongoing series within the series. But the idea that I had when I was thinking how to format talking about hundreds, possibly, of instruments is to go back to the beginning and listening to as if this was 1957 and the idea of Exotica had just been released. So really, if this just landed on the record store shelves, you went out and bought it and brought it home, what are you first going to be hearing that's going to immediately lock you in and draw you into this sound? So, side 1, track 1, Quiet Village. Now, to dive into this, my tiny little studio right here is not going to do us justice. So, for this episode, we're going to take a little field trip into what I call the big room, which is a big room. But to do that, I'm going to have to set up a little bit differently, and I should probably put on some pants. So, I'll meet you over there. Okay, so everybody's been talking about this album. You finally go out and grab it. Drop it on the record player, drop the needle, and the first sound you hear is a frog, but not a frog, right? And this is really interesting to me that they didn't record real frogs. The story is that there were frogs in the lagoon when they were playing, but instead of getting a recording of that, they mimicked the sound with this. Now, this is a fairly modern reproduction, but if you listen to our last interview with Thomas McKay, he said Lepaca Cologne has the original frog that Augie used on the recording, and I believe he did say it was in the shape of a frog. So this is made to look like a frog, but it also sounds like a frog. And this already takes us into our first tangent, because this brings in a whole category of instruments that are used throughout this album and pretty much every Exotica album afterwards, and that would be scrapers, rasps, or what we usually use the Spanish term, the güiro. Now, if you're looking this up and you're not familiar, that's G-U-I-R-O, the Spanish G. And the one that you usually see is this. A lot of times we just call it the fish. He actually has a little mouth and he looks like a fish. But basically it can be made of lots of different materials. This one is wood. The frog is wood. We can also use gourds, lots of different materials. And also what you scrape it with can be lots of different materials. So this one, this is a plastic. You can also use, a lot of times this is a timbali stick. And you can hear, I don't know how much it comes across on my phone and YouTube, but it makes a very different sound depending on what you scrape it with. Versus, or metal, very different. 9 times out of 10, I use chopsticks. Let's see, this is the cheap one that came with the Chinese takeout. Very thin kind of sound. This is a little fancier one, but still just chopstick. So very different sounds based on what you scrape it with, but then also based on what it's made out of. So this one is a gourd. It's a little more Peruvian style. So like the metal with this one. Very, very nice. So yeah, very different sounds based on what it's made out of, what you're scraping with. This one, today, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get this one. This is made by LP that makes all kinds of Latin percussion instruments. This one's actually made out of plastic, some kind of rosin. This is what they ship it with, plastic rod. And this one, especially if this is right next to your ear, like I was just holding it, this one is incredibly loud. This one was made, basically a lot of LP instruments were made after what I call the Santana effect, when they started putting Afro-Latin instruments with electric guitars, keyboards, amplified instruments. All of a sudden everything has to get louder to keep up with the electronic enhancements. So this one cuts. If I'm playing with the salsa band, this is the one that is going to do it. You can use the metal with it. In my band, we usually use this one with a timbali stick because it mutes it a little bit and puts a little bit of that wood sound back into it, so it kind of blends with the instruments a little bit. But this, the Wiro is basically the main timekeeper in most Exotica music. If you're used to, you know, rock and roll pop music, it's usually that hi-hat on the drum set. This fills that role. So it gives, you know, that timekeeping. A lot of times, and even on the album Exotica, there's sometimes where you can hear them just tapping it, just to give a little pulse going through there. And again, back in the day, they would have been using more wood or one of Arthur Lyman's favorite little phrases to play on it. Doing 2 long strokes. So that works a lot. And a lot of times on even the Exotica album, I think once they played the opening phrase on the frog, but from there, I think they went right into a metal version. Now this is a small one. You'll see bigger ones. They look like a cheese grater. It's like a real big, sometimes they call them torpedoes because they'll be shaped that way, but made out of metal. And technically, if it's made of metal instead of wood or gourd, it's called wira, with the A instead of O. But metal with metal. Real soft, smooth, kind of flowy kind of sound, a little more. Now you can hear some bigger tines on it. Even softer. Or you can get a harder rasp. But lots of different sonic possibilities can work with the Wiro, Wira. And then you may have noticed this one, as I was moving it, you've got a lot of space in there that's just asking to be used. So this one has some kind of, I think it's metal BBs in here. So it can be used that way as well. This one, I actually just bought this one today. I'm in North Carolina, the American South. We're gourd country. So we actually have a gourd festival every year, which happens to be this weekend. And I just picked this one up. This is actually a maker, I believe they're based out of Louisiana, but she's Peruvian that made it. And you can see it's got some gorgeous carving, burning, staining in there. And then the rasps are on this side. So with the metal, it sounds just beautiful. So this is going to be getting a lot of use. But also on the inside, this one has fill, I believe is plastic. And it gives almost a rain stick kind of sound. Which is just perfect. So anytime you can double up on your instruments, you know, get 2 sounds out of one, that's great. But yeah, just diving in on Quiet Village, this was the timekeeper through most of the track. And then it really just took off from there. That Exotica, that's one of the, what I would call a defining sound, is that your main timekeeper, instead of being a drum set hi-hat is going to be an actual güiro. Now, when I was in school, I studied drum set, and they told us, you know, the hi-hat, if you're playing Latin style music, the hi-hat is the substitute for güiro. But when it comes to Exotica, that's kind of the thing. You're not substituting sounds. Go for the original sound. And that's what they were using. They actually, now, they probably didn't have it back in the day, but now they actually make holders for them. And we've got this one mounted on our drums so we can play it as we're doing other things with other hands. If you're playing it traditionally, it's a two-handed instrument. And if you look up, there are masters of this instrument, and they do use both hands to get big kind of swirls and swells out of it. And because there's a sound hole on it, a sound port, and sound comes out of there, so you can kind of manipulate what the audience hears by how much of this directionality you get with that as well. So it is a two-handed instrument, but you can mount it and play it with one. You can also set it on a table and like block it in with towels or foam, something like that, to be able to play it with one hand. Sometimes I've got, this one fits in between the bars on some of my mallet instruments, so I can just set it on there and be able to scrape it in between. And then also at the gourd festival today, I found this little guy. It looks like a sweet potato, but that's a tiny little gourd, so I'm going to put some little slots in there so I can use this as a small one, and this will be able to just sit you know, inconspicuously amongst other instruments and be able to mix it up and play. So that is kind of the wide world of güiros, starting with the frog. And this one I didn't really mention, but what makes this one have such a different and unique sound is that this one is hollow, open at the mouth, so it actually pushes the sound out that way, so you get that deep resonance. It almost, it comes across as, there's a Chinese instrument that we usually call temple blocks, and it almost has that kind of sound, that deep resonant tone to it, so you get that frog-like sound. But all the way from the deep frog to the high-pitched metal, lots of different variety for tones and timbres to mix it up, so you don't always have the same sound in every song, but it fills that same role no matter what you're doing. Now, the second sound on the album, which happens immediately after the frog, is one that I can't do. It's this descending, warbling whistle kind of sound, and I cannot whistle, even just like a normal whistle. So doing that one, I can't do. I'm not sure exactly who did it, if that was Augie Cologne or one of the other band members. There are rumors out that they had a professional bird caller that would sit in sometimes, so it may have been him. I don't know who did this whistle, but it kind of became a trademark of the Exotica sound, which unfortunately I can't do, so I have substitutions. This one is a slide whistle. I found it at a toy store somewhere. It's got, if you can see it, there's a little bird. This is a cat, and there's a little bird in a cage that he's trying to get to, and it wobbles up and down, and the air goes across that as you're whistling, and it makes a little bit of a warble, and then it's got a plunger in here as well. So I do so that's my whistle. You can also do, this is more modern. I don't think this was available in 1957. This is another instrument by Latin Percussion. They call it a flexotone, and it's kind of based on the concept of a musical saw. This is a thin piece of metal right here, and then there's two strikers on it, and basically so that can do the same kind of whistling, warbling effect as well. So those can fill in for that. If you can do that whistle, mad props to you. I wish I could. If there's a way to teach somebody how to do that, please teach me, because I need that sound. Some people will sample it off of the record and just, you know, trigger it electronically. I like having it acoustic, but again, it's not exactly the way they did it. And from there, we're into the song proper. And the main instruments that we're hearing right at the beginning are piano and upright bass. I'm going to assume you're fairly familiar with those. And I actually don't have either of those instruments, so I can't demonstrate. But piano and bass, and it is interesting as well that Martin Denny is doubling the bass with his left hand on the piano. So they're overlaying those two sounds, which is great. It's this full, really resonant sound, which a lot of times in modern music, we generally don't do. A lot of time, especially in jazz, if there's somebody playing upright bass, the piano is kind of like take your left hand off of the keyboard so you're not clashing. But they went ahead and did it, just double up that low sound, which was awesome. And then also the bird calls start coming in from there, and those were done vocally live. You know, they're just making those bird calls. And then the main percussion instrument that you're hearing at that point is the bongos. And Augie Cologne was basically a bongo player. That's how he was presented. The story that I heard, it was an old interview with Martin Denny. He said, you know, one day they were playing, they were a, you know, basic kind of lounge act, and they didn't have a percussionist. It was piano, bass, and vibes. And they didn't have anybody, you know, playing drums or anything like that. And he said, one day this Puerto Rican kid shows up with a pair of bongos. And that was Augie Cologne. And so, yeah, he was known as a bongo player. He would also play congas, but mostly what we would call a hand drummer rather than a stick drum set kind of guy. So for those who don't know, these are bongos. A lot of times the big ones I'll bring out in a bit that are called congas, people will call bongos. Basically anything that you play with your hands, people will call bongos. But this is specifically this instrument. So it's two very short, fairly straight. They'll sometimes have a little bit of taper to them, but fairly straight kind of little buckets. Open on the bottom, and then two skin heads. And you see there are two sizes. They call it the macho and the hembra, the male and the female side, as in most Latin instruments. Basically, you have to awkwardly cradle them between your knees like this. Now, these days there are stands for them. I actually clamp one onto my vibraphone. But traditionally, they're played seated in between the knees like this, and then kind of played with the fingers, the martillo, and that's kind of home base for. And that's basically what Augie Cologne is playing in the first part of Quiet Village. One thing that I like to note about these is that, again, this is before the Santana effect. Bongos were tuned much lower back in the day than they are now. Now, where I have these at the moment is considered out of tune. If I was going to be playing in like a salsa band or something like that, they basically crank them to where they're just about to pop the heads. Real high pitch so that it cuts through all the other instruments. But back then, you know, a small group like that, nobody's playing amplified, there's no electronic instruments, they didn't have to deal with that, so they would be tuned a lot lower. And then especially they were playing at an outdoor bar in Hawaii with skin heads. They're going to be fairly loose just from all the humidity. So they probably couldn't get them that tight. But yeah, much lower sound than what we're used to. A lot of times when you're listening to old recordings, what we think of as congas is actually bongos, because everything is congas now are where bongos used to be, tuning wise. So yeah, very low pitched, and they get a lot more resonance that way and kind of blend in with the other instruments instead of sticking out above them, which is a very cool sound. And from there, we go to the B section of the tune, and we're introduced finally to the vibraphone. So this instrument, at the time when this tune came out, it was still relatively new. The vibraphone was invented in the early 1920s, was kind of being developed. Didn't start becoming popular until Lionel Hampton in the 1930s. So looking into the late 50s, this is still a pretty new instrument. So, you know, if you're looking for an exotic sound, find something that nobody's really heard before. So this kind of fit the bill for that. It also fits in really well to the context of this small group, because it could play both lead lines and accompaniments, because you can play chords, at least 4-note chords. It's not as big as a piano, but you can play background chords. The tone of it somewhat cuts through to play lead lines on top of the piano, so those two instruments can mesh together pretty well. And then it also has some similar sounds to, like, you know, the slide guitar that's popular in Hawaii, that kind of thing. The steel guitar sounds like that. So it's a very versatile instrument, so it really fit the bill for this small group that they were playing in. Now, I do want to talk about this instrument specifically a little bit. I realize that a lot of people maybe haven't seen one up close, haven't seen one in person. A lot of times when I play, people don't even know what this instrument is, so I'll talk about it a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and go into a little bit of a diversion, and we'll talk about some other melodic percussion instruments while we're here. So first thing about the vibraphone specifically, what makes it different than other melodic percussion instruments is the keys are made out of metal, usually aluminum. Early on, they experimented with steel, but aluminum is generally what you're going to find. Some of them have, you'll see brass-coated bars, but it's aluminum underneath. They have these tubes, which are called resonators, and in the resonators, there are little paddles, little fans, and there's a motor that drives those fans. So without it, when I played just a moment ago, it didn't have the fans going. So all of a sudden, with the fans, you can hear that vibrato effect, which is where it gets its name. So the sustain has that nice, lovely little warble to it, which is characteristic. Also, the pedal mechanism. So there's a damper bar right here. If you play with the pedal up, very short percussive sounds, and then if you release the damper by pressing the pedal, you get a very extended sustain. That'll go just for much too long. So you're basically constantly working that pedal to develop the length of the notes. So you can always tell a vibraphone player from a distance, because we're all hunched back and we have scoliosis because we're standing on one leg all night. So yeah, you're basically standing on one foot using the other pedal, and then we tend to hunch over the bars, which is bad and we're not supposed to, so we get a good stretch like that. But that's basically the characteristics of the vibraphone. Metal bars, fans in the resonator, pedal, that's what gets it that sound. While we're here in chromatic percussion land, I'm going to go ahead and jump into another instrument, just so we can kind of compare and contrast. A couple tunes down the record, we come into Hong Kong blues, where we hear the xylophone. So a lot of times people will see the vibraphone and call it a xylophone. They're completely different instruments. First off, xylo is the Greek root for wood. So xylophones are wooden instruments. So instead of the metallic kind of sound, Hong Kong blues, so much more sharp, but still some warmth from the woodiness. Now this one is actually a synthetic. It's a form of fiberglass that they use to mimic wooden bars. Back in the day, they would have had a wooden xylophone. So it gives that sharp percussive attack, but a little different character from the vibraphone. Now, one thing to notice about these is that they do use different types of mallets. The xylophone, the bars are so thick and sharp. The soft mallets don't really carry through in a, if it's just me in a room, that's nice to practice with because it's not so loud. But those soft bars don't really cut Now, opposite, if I was to use these hard mallets on the vibes, much too bright. The attack is just irritating there. So those bars, or the mallets, don't transfer. So you can't really do quick switches between these instruments. I'll show you the fix to that in a moment, but for the xylophone here. So they did tend to use one or the other in a lot of these tunes, that he didn't switch back and forth a lot. One sound that's kind of cool, Arthur Lyman had a thing that he would do a lot of times using the backs of the mallet. And a lot of times they would overlay that with other sounds. Sometimes there would be somebody else playing. There's a couple tunes where if you listen really close, it sounds like they're doing octaves. So one person would play like the lower register with the back ends, another person would play higher with the regular mallets, and kind of blend those tones. Sometimes he would be playing the stick ends on top of the piano, or other things like that. So sometimes they would kind of layer those sounds, but in some of those more kind of Chinese, Asian type tunes that they put on there, you'll hear a little tiki kind of sound like that, and he's using the back ends of the mallet. So that was a little trick that Arthur Lyman used to do when he broke off and started making his own albums. You can hear that in a lot of different places. He'll use that trick. Moving on to our third option, this is the marimba. So this one has wooden bars as well, but they're tuned to be a little more kind of mellow, a little more sustained. Very nice for kind of rolling. Or you can play, sometimes it can kind of fill the niche of maybe like a nylon string guitar. Playing figures like that also works melodically as well, just a nice warm kind of sound. So the xylophone has that sharp tiki kind of sound. This is a little more resonant. In some ways blends better with the vibraphone. And you would find in both groups, Arthur Lyman himself, and then when he was playing with Martin Denny, and once he left, they kind of kept it. They would keep these two instruments right next to each other. There's a great video of Martin Denny playing. I'll look it up and see if I can find it. I'll link it in the description. But they're playing out in an open field, and there's like hula dancers and things like that. And you can see the vibes in the marimba are angled right up next to each other, where you could play one hand on each instrument at the same time, or you can make a quick switch. So these instruments, the marimba and the vibraphone, can both use the same mallets. So you can do quick switches there. So a lot of times just in different sections of the tune, they would get the different timbres by making quick switches onto those instruments. So this one blends a lot better than the xylophone when you're mixing with the vibes. And then one last melodic percussive instrument. This is the glockenspiel. Sometimes we call it orchestra bells. Very high-pitched, very resonant, still going. Doesn't have the foot pedal, the damper pedal, to really control that sustain, so it tends to just kind of ring out quite a bit. This instrument really cuts through, in some ways similar to the xylophone. It's got that sharp attack, so it'll really cut through. But if played lightly, it can blend with other instruments very well. You'll hear this sound, a lot of times it's not this specific instrument, but you'll hear this one in their tunes kind of layering with others to get almost like a music box kind of sound. Now, a lot of times what they would use, there's a couple other options, and I think they may have switched. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes just from the recording quality, and sometimes because the instruments are all very similar to each other. But there's glockenspiel. There's also a toy piano, which in some of the videos you can see they would tend to stack a toy piano on top of the regular piano, where a toy piano is very similar. It's got metal bars or rods inside, but it's played with a keyboard like a regular piano, but it makes a very similar sound. And then there is also an instrument called a tabletop celesta, which is basically these bars with hard hammers that could hit it, and again played with a piano keyboard. So those two instruments, especially if the recording quality isn't, pristine, those instruments are very hard to distinguish one from the other. But it would go for this type of sound and then layering on top with the other instruments. Now, as far as I mentioned, the quick switches between vibe and marimba, this one can use the same mallet as the xylophones, so you can get quick switches there as well. So lots of good options for layering. And also, because all of these instruments are laid out like piano keyboards, even someone, even if you can't pull off a 4-mallet extended technique kind of thing, most people can find notes on these. So you'll hear a lot of times a fun little exercise in these tunes sometimes is trying to figure out who plays what, because they're switching instruments all over the place. And if you try to pick a player and when one instrument goes away and another one comes up, well, that guy must have started playing that instrument. So sometimes it's fun to try and figure out who is playing what. Sometimes they definitely did have extra players sitting in. Sometimes you'll hear 5 instruments stacked on top of each other, so there must have been a 5th player there to play it. And you could get, just about any musician with any kind of keyboard fluency can at least find notes on these. So if you needed to just stack something quickly, somebody could jump in and play it. So they're very accessible that way. You don't have to be a dedicated vibes player like Arthur Lyman to be able to pull off, anybody can do hot cross buns on the bells. So little things like that you'll hear. They just wanted to fill out the sound and get interesting textures by combining. So these high-end metallics like the glockenspiel or the toy piano, somebody could just jump on and play that instrument. One final instrument introduced in this first track, when we're trying to build into the climax of the piece, they needed something to kind of push it into a new energy, a new feeling, and so they do that build with a cymbal. Now, cymbals can actually come in all different shapes and sizes. For this one, they went with a fairly large and thick cymbal. This one is actually thinner, probably, than what they used. They all give very different sounds, very different textures to the music. One interesting thing to look at with cymbals is that they can be used basically in 3 different ways. One of them is what I just did, the swell, where you use soft mallets. And interesting to note, just by trying to track who was doing what in the piece, I think it was probably Arthur Lyman had a cymbal right by his vibes and he reached over to do it, because you can use soft mallets just like vibraphone mallets would make a really good swell on a cymbal. So just by using those soft mallets and just gently going back and forth, you get a nice build up that way. They can also be used, of course, just if you hit it, you get a crash. And then you can also do what we, as drummers, we tend to call ride, where you play a consistent rhythm in a timekeeping role. And interesting to note how little cymbals are used in Exotica music in general. They kind of reserve them for those big impact moments, like that build in Quiet Village. Every once in a while you'll get a big crash on it. Much less than in other styles of music, though. A lot of times rock and pop music, every 8 bars or so, there's got to be some kind of crash cymbal. Even in jazz, any little impact point, they're going to crash on that cymbal. And in Exotica music, we're not really going as much for big impacts, just left and right. So there are a lot fewer crashes. And then almost never using a cymbal in that ride style where you're just constantly pinging away on a rhythm. I'm not going to say never, but very little do they do that. And to me, that's one of the characteristics of Exotica music, one of the things that kind of sets it apart from other styles, where in jazz music, one of the main voices is playing that ride cymbal. In rock and pop music, they're almost always playing either the hi-hats, the closed cymbals, or on a ride cymbal, just constantly keeping that rhythm. In Exotica music, we're going to do that with other instruments. We've already mentioned, the güiro tends to be a main timekeeper. If not that, it could be maybe even a shaker, or sometimes they didn't actually do it on this album, but Arthur Lyman was a big fan of doing the Latin style of playing a timbale, playing on the shell to keep that rhythmic element going. We'll get into that when we get into some of Arthur Lyman's interesting additions to the instrument collection in Exotica. And then another thing that tends to happen sometimes in Exotica music is just not having that voice, not having a constant rhythm going through the whole thing. There's so much more of just shifting textures and timbres all over the place instead of constantly having one voice going through the whole tune. From there we go to Return to Paradise, which opens with this beautiful sound. Of tinkling wind chimes. Now they're using, these are made of shells. The ones they're using were either shell or glass. It's a very similar sound, but there's a lot of variety that can happen in wind chimes. These are also shells. Bamboo. More shells. Metallic bars. I'm sure there's more around here. Oh, here's some more. Wind chimes everywhere. Obviously, one of my favorites. Interesting to note, one wind chime sound that you will not hear on the original Martin Denny, Arthur Lyman, Les Baxter, anybody from that era, a sound you will not hear on those recordings is one we're all very familiar with today. These descending or ascending tuned wind chimes. In the orchestra world, we call this the mark tree. This was actually invented in 1967. This is a very new instrument, relatively speaking. It was invented by a guy named Mark Stevens, who was a LA session recording musician. He's still out there doing it. Great guy. I don't know him, but I've talked to him on Facebook and such. We've corresponded, and yeah, real cool guy. He's out there, doing the thing. But I've heard a few different stories about how this came to be, but yeah, the mark tree, they wanted a specific kind of wind chime sound, and he kind of came up with this idea of putting, I think at one point it may have been actually tuned like glockenspiel bars, but then he just got the idea, just like this chime, this guy here, that's just a bunch of, bars in a circle. He was like, well, instead of putting them in a random configuration, what if we kind of put them tuned, or at least in pitch order? And so he came up with that. And it's just a side note that I like to think of when I'm doing it. Now, if this instrument had been available, would Martin Denny have used it? Absolutely. They probably would have thrown it on everything, if they had it, but they didn't. So in modern Exotica, absolutely, it's totally legit to use that. But if you're going for an old school, original Exotica sound, that's one of those tells that they didn't use it just because they didn't have it. So nothing against using it, but if you're going for that old school sound, that's one way to kind of make sure that you get it by not using that instrument. Also going through this track, there is a very large drum, and I don't know specifically what drum they were playing, but it is a large, some kind of big bassy sounding drum. And this gets into the area where, you know, especially at this time, there weren't as many commercial drum manufacturers out there, and they were just getting stuff from wherever they got it from. So there's no telling what big drum it was. I will mention this configuration. Let me move the camera so you can see a little bit more of what's happening here. So this main one right here is very tall, and then there's a couple smaller ones coming off. There's our old friend the Wiro, and this little post right here, there's usually a cymbal on there, but I took it off just so we can kind of see what's happening. This is what's referred to as a cocktail kit, and a lot of it was used for that if you're playing, you know, in a cocktail band. It's a way to have a very small footprint on stage when you're in a small enclosed area. You'll see these a lot. Rockabilly bands kind of latched onto this. The Stray Cats drummer uses it. The tall drum, you can put an inverted pedal that swings up to play it, so you can play it like a bass drum. And then a lot of times one of these small drums will have snares on it, so it makes that backbeat rock and roll kind of snare. I took mine off, so these just act as toms. I just mentioned this because this is a lot of times in the Arthur Lyman band. Harold Chang was the drummer, and he would play this kind of configuration, and he had lots of other stuff as well, but this was kind of his home base of operations when they were playing. So rather than what we think of as a traditional drum kit, he was kind of using this, and instead of playing, you know, normal drum set patterns, he's almost doing the bongo or congo parts here. So more playing, you know, kind of a lot of times what we call jungle drums, you know, just playing the toms and things like that instead of backbeats like a jazz drummer would do. And it is said, assumed, maybe alleged, that Harold Chang did sit in with the Martin Denny group frequently, especially on recordings. I talked about before about trying to track who's playing what, and sometimes there definitely was a fifth person in there. There's just too much happening. And a lot of times I generally assume when it was percussion, drum related stuff, it was probably Harold Chang sitting in with him, and that's how he got hooked up with Arthur Lyman later. There's a lot of conjecture going on there on my part, but that's what I'm going with for now. Also to mention in Return to Paradise, lots of big swells on cymbals, like we already talked about. He's using the toy piano, which I believe we mentioned earlier. Hopefully I said that. At the very beginning, you can hear a little swirly kind of thing going on the vibraphone, and then there's another sound that sounds like a higher pitch on the vibraphone, but I believe he's actually using the toy piano there, and those sounds just really blend together really well. And also lots of big swells on gong, which is going to be a good transition into the next track where we'll talk about gongs. And from there we're into Hong Kong Blues, our second track on the album, which opens with a resounding gong. Very similar to cymbals, gongs, large, round, metallic objects, come in all shapes and sizes. I've got some tiny ones here, which these come into play later in the album as well. And it's interesting that gongs are a little bit of a mystery. You never really know exactly what you're going to get. This, on paper, is the exact same gong as the other one, with a very different pitch. They're the same size, same thickness. They've got the same model number on them. And because I never take my price tags off, they were the same exact price. So these are the same gong, but they have very different pitches and tonal characteristics. So every little aspect of the creation process, and then, you know, different shapes and sizes make wildly different tones on gongs. So there's a lot to explore and play with there. This is another one that I have. This is one of my favorite ones because it's the most annoying. It's called a Chinese opera gong. But yeah, lots of variety there, different shapes and sizes. You'll hear some, and I believe they use them later on the album as well. Sometimes you'll have usually a smaller gong. They can get big as well, and it'll have a little button in the middle, which tends to make it more of a pitch. They'll produce close to an actual note, so you can actually play them melodically. Sometimes people will call that, in our last episode, we talked about the Javanese or Balinese gamelan, and sometimes people will associate those sounds with the gamelan. It's not exactly the same, but it, again, in an Exotica kind of way, it kind of takes you to that place. I don't believe I have any button gongs. If I do, I've forgotten. I've got so much stuff, y'all. But those are gongs. So again, just to kind of show the wide world there, Hong Kong blues opens and closes with the big gong stroke, and then smaller ones come into play in other places in the album, and generally when they want to give that feeling of something, more typically Asian. I read it as Chinese. But yeah, that kind of gives the sound that they're going for there. And then again, right up at the top of the Hong Kong blues, they play this little riff. Something along those lines. This is a ukulele, which is not what they played. And I'm not exactly sure what they played. It's some type of Asian stringed instrument. You can hear it's got the strings. It's probably got frets of some sort, and I'm not really as familiar with those instruments, nor do I own them. It could have been a pipa, which is sometimes referred to as a Chinese guitar. There's another one they call the I believe it's ruan, or a moon lute, I think they call it. It's shaped, it's got a big round, I'll show a picture. It looks like a moon. But it's some sort of Asian lute or stringed instrument, probably fretted. And I believe they just did it for that one lick at the beginning and the end, because throughout the rest of it, they're doing it on the piano and xylophone that we already talked about. And finally, on Hong Kong blues, I would say the main percussive instrument in that track is castanets. I've got mine mounted. We call this a castanet machine, for lack of a better term. So this one's mounted so you can put it on a stand and actually play it with mallets or hands or whatever's available. This is kind of the orchestral way of doing it. We also sometimes will use them on handles, where you pull a handle off of this and you can tap it on your knee. Traditionally, though, just this clamshell part has a string going through it, which you put over two fingers and you play them like this, kind of clapping them against each other. That's how the flamenco dancers use them. But that's that kind of constant percussive sound that's going through that track. Do want to mention on this track, he's using a different piano than what he usually uses. And it's what we sometimes refer to as a tack piano, or sometimes they'll call it a honky-tonk piano. This is a piano hammer. This is what actually makes the sound. This strikes the string. Again, I've got a lot of weird stuff laying around. I've got 88 of these, by the way, that I need to do something with. But yeah, this is a piano hammer, and what they'll do is actually take a brass thumbtack and poke it into the felt, so that instead of soft felt hitting the string, it's metallic brassy sound, which cuts through a lot more, which is why they would use them in old honky-tonks. You're in a noisy environment with an old out-of-tune upright piano. Adding a tack to the hammer is going to make it a lot louder. And in this case, it gives it that exotic sound. You can also hear, this is, I don't know if they took it directly from Les Baxter, but he would use it in some of his tracks. On Ritual of the Savage, there's one track that uses to great effect, uses a tack piano. So that's the sound that you're hearing there, blending with that sharp percussive attack of the xylophone, along with that brassy percussive sound from the tack piano. You get a really interesting combination there, which again is very exotic. And from there we go into the Busy Porch. One of my favorite tunes in general. I love the original Les Baxter version is absolutely one of my favorites. But as far as new instruments coming into play, we're introduced finally to the congas. The first little riff you'll hear, just to show the difference, the first little thing that happens, you hear a roll on bongos. That's the high-pitched drum. And then from there he goes into the congas. The bongos come back later at the very end. But to show the difference, I mentioned this, I think, when we were talking about bongos. Some people just call anything you play with your hands bongos. Bongo, conga. Very different instruments. The bongos, because they're so small, you're playing mostly with fingers, where congas are large, so you can get your full hands on them. So there's some more techniques that come into play. Also want to mention, side note, I guess, but as I've been talking about, we're going through this album, I didn't mention there are two versions of this album. If you don't know the whole story there, the mono and the stereo versions are actually completely different recordings. I won't get into the whole deal now, but look that up, check it out, it's pretty interesting. But this is one of those tunes where you can really hear that this is a different song. The parts are very different in what they're playing. In a lot of ways, I like the original because it's a little more raw, I guess, for lack of a better term. Especially when you're listening to what Augie Cologne was playing. The original version is a little less polished, maybe, which is kind of cool. He was just kind of going for it, as opposed to in the stereo version, they had been playing this tune for a long time, and it was a little more clean in what he was playing. But it's kind of cool just to listen to the differences there. But so congas traditionally, like old school tradition in Cuba, where these drums come from, this goes back. This is a African design, and you can almost say it's fairly worldwide. A big drum with one skin on the top, open on the bottom. You can find that across cultures, but ostensibly from Africa to Cuba, where the term conga came from, and they actually call them tumbadoras. Conga is this one. So quinto, conga, tumba. And in modern versions, you can find more as well. Some people will have a 5-drum setup where there's a requinto, which is smaller, and a super tumbo, which is bigger. 99% of the time, you're going to see people playing just 2. I like to bring in a 3rd in some situations. But I did mention before, in the 50s, 60s, drums were tuned much lower than they are now, where basically where their bongos are tuned are kind of what we today would bring congas up to. So these I actually didn't tune at all. This is just how they're sitting in my basement. And this one is about where it sits on the original mono version. That's about where his drum is sitting for this one. So he had them tuned super low, which is a really cool sound, because in some ways, because of the mono nature of it and how they recorded these with distant mics, it doesn't cut through at all. It's very much in the background. It's just this underlying throbbing kind of sound going through, where again, if you listen to the stereo version, he's got it tuned a little more higher, and they've got the microphone placed more on what he's doing, so you can hear it cut through a little bit more, which is a completely different experience. But yeah, a very low conga, and you can hear, I'll do it on the low drum. These drums, basically, you can get 3 basic sounds and then a lot of variations beyond that. But yeah, he's kind of... that's kind of the traditional conga pattern. That's more what he played on the stereo version. In the mono, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what he's playing, but he's getting that pop that we call a slap, and then the open tones. And it does sound like he has multiple drums. It sounds like you get, you know, different sounds coming out. So 3 different sounds from 3 drums, but then each drum plus. And then there's a lot of on congas, a lot of on the drum kind of stuff that happens as well. So yeah, traditional starting point pattern. Which again, I would actually play on the higher drum. Something like that. So, conga versus bongo. Okay, and then also in this tune they bring into play the cowbells, which we're probably mostly familiar with from Saturday Night Live, if nothing else. But cowbell, and these do come in different sizes as well. I've got 2 right here. There's also a 3rd kind of standard size that I've got one. It's in the pile somewhere. I don't know. But this is kind of home base. It's called a mambo bell. Then this would be the bongo bell. And then there's a tiny little cha-cha bell, which is just little. And you know, is basically what they're playing there. So the little one versus the big one. And then these, just like cymbals, you know, every little change that you make to these, to the shape, the size, the thickness of the metal, what metal you use, every little thing is going to change the sound in some way. So there's a lot of variety in cowbells. You'll see in modern, like salsa bands and stuff, they'll have like 6, 8 cowbells just because there's so much variation you can do. Speaking of variation, this is one that you'll see sometimes, which is very similar. This is more the Brazilian version, which is called a go-go, which has 2, and those will come into play in lots of Exotica tunes, as well as traditional, you know, Brazilian. That, and then here's the West African version they call gangokwi. Usually more is kind of how that's played. So similar to cowbell, different. It's more rounded, where the cowbell is more kind of oblong type shape. And then obviously having the 2 stacked on top of each other. But that's where they would get those kind of hard metallic sounds coming out. So again, in this tune, he's playing the, which is a typical kind of mambo pattern, and is when they go into what I would call the mambo part of the song. And full disclosure, he starts out on the cowbell, and then he goes to, and that thing that I said they almost never do, he switches that rhythm over to a cymbal, and he plays the same rhythm on a cymbal. So I did say they almost never do it. This is one of those cases where he did do that. He switched over and played it on a cymbal. And just for those who are tracking along, I'm pretty sure listening to it, when they go into that mambo section, the vibraphone drops out. So it was probably Arthur Lyman playing the cowbell and cymbal, and you hear Augie goes from the congas back to the bongos. So they start, everything gets big and loud, so that low tune conga just wouldn't be heard at that point. So he goes back to the bongo, which that higher pitch cuts through better, and it brings that energy for that mambo section that they use to close it out. Super cool tune, love it, and they brought in some new sounds there. Okay, turning to Lotus Land, starts off with different sizes of gongs, and then there's another new sound that comes to play kind of in between the gongs, which is this. So these are, we usually call them just finger cymbals. And again, come in all different shapes and sizes. There are smaller, thinner ones that belly dancers use. Usually call them zills. And they'll put them on their fingers just like castanets. And they can play those while they're dancing. I like these with a little bit of cup shape to it, have a little bit fuller tone. And then if we want to go really big, I like these. I stuck these on handles for other purposes. But same idea. Just a lot more resonant and swirly. This is more of a Tibetan or Nepalese design. And they usually, just like the others, they usually have them on a string where you can kind of hit them together, but I like on handles, as I actually use these as mallets on my glockenspiel. But those are the finger cymbals, so you hear that real high-pitched bell in there. And then I also want to mention, oh, and there's the glass wind chimes going through the whole thing. It's very soft and mellow kind of sound. Later on, or not much later on in the tune, but as they get into it, you'll hear a sound that we talked about cymbals before, but I didn't show this technique that they're actually using, where they took like a wire brush and just kind of scrape across it, and it gives it that nice little swish going through there. So they use that throughout that whole song as well to get that spacey, dreamy kind of sound that they were going for. And then lastly, on Lotus Land, we bring in traditional percussion instrument. They've got a snare drum played it a fairly traditional jazz kind of way. They're using brushes. So wire brush swishing along the head, just like a drum set player would do. So in my aversion to drum set in Exotica, they did it right there on the first album. So again, that's just a me thing. And then from there, they do go into kind of a traditional swing at the end. Just like, you know, any traditional jazz band would do. So they do bring in that, you know, showing that side of who they are and what they were doing as well, just to finish it out with that traditional, old school American swing. Okay, and that brings us to Similo, which opens with a vocal singing the oh. I'm assuming that's the band just doing it. Nice callback to Les Baxter. You know, that was one of his techniques of having what we would say wordless vocals, oohs and ahs kind of things. Just really using the voice as an instrument rather than expressing words. So even though Similo wasn't a Baxter song, it's definitely a callback to one of his techniques. And from there, we're back into the bird calls and all that kind of stuff. One of the new instruments introduced in this tune is maracas, which, again, a whole nother world of instruments available there. Typically, a maraca can be made of just about anything on the outside and the inside. So anything that can be made hollow and then something put inside to shake. So this one is actually made of rawhide, and I'm assuming it's some sort of a plastic bead inside there. But again, it's one of those instruments that every aspect that you change is going to give a different sound, different timbre. So there's a lot of variation that can be used. So traditionally, you know, natural material, so rawhide, gourds, wood, coconuts. These are seed pods with little shakers inside them. And then even this is like a metal tin can kind of thing. This one we've used before. This was the metal Wiro, but it's filled with some sort of fill to get that more metallic sound. These days, more likely than not, we're going to use plastic. The harder the material, the more it's going to cut through other instruments. So this one is actually made just like the plastic Wiro I had. This one is made of plastic to kind of compete against more electronic instruments or electric. And then even to where this one is made of natural fibers woven. It's a basket. And then it's got a leather flat piece on the bottom for accents. And every country or culture around the world is going to have some version of this, and they're going to have a different name for it. This one's usually called kashishi. A lot of these I can't even remember all the names of them. This one is similar sound, just a different way of doing it. Instead of putting a fill inside a container, this one's just made of individual seed pods, and they shake against each other. And this one then takes the opposite method. Instead of putting fill inside a gourd, this one puts it on the outside. So it's a woven net covered with beads. This is kind of a West African version. They call it shakere. And then you can also tap them for more control, which I like. You can kind of... if you put grooves on the outside of, in this case, a gourd, I've seen them with coconuts as well, you can put grooves like a Wiro, and then you can take those beads and scrape them. This one makes a sound itself, but even without grooves, but with grooves it would add to that. And then you're into the world of what we call kabasa, which this is the metallic version of that, the afushi kabasa. So it's got, if you can see, in between the beads, there's little grooves on a little tin strip. So when it shakes across, similar to a maraca, just a slightly different timbre. And then again, this gives us a hollow space, so I filled this one with, I think, plastic BBs, so it can make it into a maraca as well. So lots of variations there, lots of sound colors and choices that can all fall into that same category of the maraca. And then I believe the final instrument that's introduced on the original Exotica album is the claves. They bring them in on the track China Nights, but you'll hear these all over the place. Traditionally, claves are the instrument and also the rhythm that's played on the instrument. The rhythmic foundation of most Afro-Cuban music is called clave, and it's basically has two parts. There's 3 notes and then 2 notes. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Or you can go the other way, you can do 2 and then 3. And there are lots of different variations on the clave, but that's kind of the rhythmic structure that holds the music together. But it's basically just 2 pieces of, resonant hardwood played against each other. This that you're seeing on here, I never take price tags off of things, but that's the price tag, so that's not part of the instrument. It does help me, though, to find that these 2, I don't know if you can tell just from looking on the camera, but these 2 sticks are slightly different diameters. And it's very subtle, so I leave the sticker on one of them so I can tell that well-made claves, like most Latin instruments, there's what they call a male and a female, a high and a low pitch. So these do have, let me get something neutral. Here's a drumstick. So if I tap this one with the drumstick and this one, they've got different pitches. And so you get a more complex sound. by striking the two against each other. To me, I get more resonance if I hold this one and tap with this one. I'm sure nobody else can notice, but to me, that makes me happy. So these are my go-to pair of claves, but they can be just about anything. These are ones I picked up. We had a performance with kids ensemble where I needed about 10 different sets of claves. So these are ones I got for, $5 a piece. And they've got their own sound to them. And then you can take just about anything. I mean, in a pinch, I'll take these maracas and you can knock them against each other. One of those modern drum set substitutions that we tend to do is taking a drumstick and clicking it against the rim. Click it against the rim. That's, when you're playing drum set and trying to cover a lot of sounds, that's the go-to clave sound for that. But again, that's the claves in a nutshell.
So, wow, right? Altogether, I think just browsing through my list, I think we covered about 26 different instruments right there. And that's just from the first Exotica album. That's not even scratching the surface of everything that was used, in the 50s. And then today, a whole explosion of more options that are available. One of the things that looking at old newspaper clippings and reviews and announcements of concerts and things like that, a lot of people would mention just how many instruments were used on stage in a Martin Denny performance. And when they toured, I don't know how they did it, but they would carry just tons of instruments with them. These weren't the kinds of things where you could just be like, show up and be like, hey, we need these, 40 different instruments. They would have had to have carried them with them. I'm sure they picked up things along the way. Martin Denny would mention that people would bring him instruments. They knew that he's doing all this crazy stuff, and people would travel the world and be like, oh, this is something Martin Denny would like. So people were always bringing him new things. So just a huge assortment of instruments. And again, that's not even scratching the surface. I'll probably do another one of these looking at an Arthur Lyman album where he brought in even more sounds and colors. And then getting into today, we've got more commercially available instruments. There are more commonly known instruments from around the world that are being brought in because, travel and commerce and all these things are so much easier today. If I want an instrument from China, I can get on eBay and get a Chinese traditional instrument. I can get things from, one of the main suppliers that I get stuff from is based in Pakistan. So they've got all kinds of Pakistani and Indian and Himalayan type instruments, just they're there. You can get them. So the world that we live in today, there's so much more available to us, readily available. And then that's not even mentioning electronics. Basically almost any sound that you want, you can get electronically. You can get samples of those instruments. And then you can create instruments that don't even exist in the real world, but are purely synthetic. So really sky's the limit. And again, a lot of times I like to, since I'm into the old school way of doing things, I would think, okay, is this an instrument that they used? And then the question comes up, is this an instrument that was available for them to use? A lot of things they just didn't have access to that we have to today. So then you get into judgment calls. Would they have used it if they had it available to them? And the answer to that question is probably yes. No matter what you're looking at, if it's some weird kind of sound, they probably would have gone for it. Getting into the electronic world, there's an interview with Martin Denny where he's talking about the Moog album, where they took some of his tunes and tried making them electronically. He didn't actually play on that album, But there is an interview where he says he went to one of the sessions just to see what it was all about, and he didn't really care for it. And it wasn't so much the sound or the timbre of the Moog. The fact that what he didn't like about it was the fact that the early synthesizers, like that first Moog, you couldn't actually play chords. So any chordal stuff they did, they had to record multiple takes and do single monophonic lines and stack them on top of each other, and he just didn't have any time for that. So he never really got into electronic synthesizers like that, just because they were monophonic. And being a piano player, you can hear that old stuff. He's using all 10 fingers all up and down the keyboard. So he wasn't going to go in and record single lines. Now, today's, when we have polyphonic synthesizers and you can play 10 notes at a time, he probably would have been all about it, and then the fact that he could carry 50 instruments in a laptop and just press a button instead of having to bring all those instruments, there's no doubt in my mind that he would have utilized that technology had it been available. But, one of the great things about what they were doing is that they did what they could do, and they were pushing boundaries. And a lot of times it's said that there's freedom in restriction. So truly groundbreaking musicians and artists of any discipline, the ones that are really known for pushing boundaries, the ones that say here's what's available to me and how can I stretch that to its limits and come up with new things out of old materials, and not letting those restrictions hold them back, but push them into new ground. That's where the artistry lies, and I think that's a lot of what Exotica was and what it continues to be. The people that are out there doing new things in Exotica today are pushing those boundaries and not letting the restrictions of today's technology hold them back. As few restrictions as there are anymore. Pretty much anything you can imagine, you can come up with a way to do. So yeah, the art continues, the boundaries remain to be pushed, and we keep experimenting and seeing where we can go with new things. But that was all started way back when people had an idea and they found a way to make it happen. So with that, I think we've covered all we can cover with our first round of the instruments of Exotica. For with that, I'll say once again, mahalo, thank you for sticking around and checking it out. And for today, that's going to be an aloha, and we'll see you next time at the Exotica Lounge.